And I'm happy to be here with you all. So welcome everyone. We are happy that we have so many people here. So this event has been organized by members of New York Renews, which is a coalition of over 320 environmental justice, faith, labor, and community groups, and the force behind the nation's most progressive climate law, as many of us know, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as CLCPA. So tonight we'll be discussing how we can make a difference in New York's climate blueprint by continuing to weigh in and ramp up on our advocacy. So we will hear from a Climate Action Council member today, Peter Ionowitz, on his insights and updates since the comment period, before introducing actions that we've created to help intervene in this particular moment. So the contents of this presentation will focus on the perspectives of New York Renews and our allies, and is centered around uplifting the recommendations of our environmental justice partners within the Climate Justice Working Group. So the content of this presentation today is meant to support your ongoing efforts and actions around this process. And our intentions for tonight is to walk away with an understanding of the importance of the climate law and have mitigating climate change and the power we've had during the path toward the development of the final scoping plan in order to implement this law, and a desire and motivation to continue influencing the process to match and exceed the work of our opponents. So we hope after tonight you'll leave here assured of the tools that we need to continue to advocate for climate justice in New York in this very moment. So there's a lot of things for us to cover tonight in just 60 minutes. But before we dive into it, we're just going to cover some brief logistics before we get started. Next slide, please. So just for some virtual housekeeping here, we have pointed out a few different things. The stop video, if you do not wish to be on camera, this session will be recorded today. So if you do not wish to have your camera on, by all means, please turn it off. But please know that this session will be recorded today. Similarly, you're able to see the participants, and we also ask that everybody remains on mute until the Q&A section, just so that we can make sure that we all are respectful of one another and that we are able to get through the whole presentation in the allotted time. Next slide, please. So we also will have closed captioning. So they are enabled, and you can turn this on and off by clicking on this closed captioning button on the control bar on the bottom here. Next slide, please. Also use the chat function. Feel free to introduce yourself. You could say your organization, your name, your pronouns, and what land you are on. If you need any technical assistance during this presentation, please reach out to Aurora. She is our tech support. So you could go ahead and shoot her a text, or you could send her a message directly in the chat if you feel like that's a better option for you. Next slide, please. So right now, I'm just going to ask that everyone, if you have not done so already, to please put your name, pronouns, organization, if applicable, and the native land that you are on. If you are not sure what land you're on, you could head over to that website that we have here on the slide to learn what land you are currently on. But with that being said, I really just want to welcome everyone to our space today. Again, my name is Celeste Perez, she, her, aya pronouns. And it's important today to start with land acknowledgement, especially considering Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day. So I am virtually gathered with you all on the rightful land of the Lenape peoples, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout generations. While we are based in different lands, it's important that we commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards to the land and people that inhabit them. So before we dive in, again, keep introducing yourselves in the chat. Next slide, please. So just a brief overview of our agenda. So our agenda tonight consists of a very brief level setting of the climate law and the Climate Action Council, also known as the CAC. Then an overview of progress and concerns about what's come out of the different subgroups so far, namely what's called the gas transition subgroup, Q&A. We'll also have Q&A and an overview of the two most important ways that you can influence the process and tools and resources that have been created for you guys to do so. So as mentioned, you should come away from this call with an understanding of the process and most importantly, the biggest way to influence it. So right now I will pass it off to Amanda Sachs, who will provide some background on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, again, often called the CLCPA, and the process that has unfolded since its passage.
Thank you so much, Celeste. Hi, all. I'm so happy to be with you all. My name is Amanda Sachs. I am a white woman with brown wavy hair. I work with an organization called Environmental Advocates NY and work closely with New York Renews. And I'm going to attempt to give you the briefest overview of New York's climate law, the Climate Action Council, and the Climate Justice Working Group, so we can get on to more of the substance of what you can do to advocate for more just decarbonization of the state. Next slide, please. Let's start with New York's climate law. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed in 2019. It created the Climate Action Council, who are charged with writing what's called a scoping plan. And the scoping plan is meant to meet the mandates and goals of the climate law, which among others requires an 100% carbon neutral economy by 2050 and at least 35% investment in disadvantaged communities from climate funds. A couple of these Climate Action Council members are New York Renews members, a few are allies, and there are 2 members of the fossil fuel industry on the panel, and then several folks who are somewhere in between the spectrum of climate activist and fossil fuel industry member, which is a large spectrum. The climate law also created what's called the Climate Justice Working Group, and they're tasked with establishing criteria to identify disadvantaged communities in New York State so that the right communities that need investment most are prioritized for pollution reductions, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and of course, at least 35% of the state's climate and clean energy funds. The Climate Justice Working Group has responded to the draft scoping plan that the Climate Action Council developed and released earlier this year, January 2020, with very specific feedback to ensure that the recommendations that the Climate Action Council develops, the final recommendations, are aligned with the equity provisions of the climate law. Their feedback has yet to be integrated, though it's been referenced to and is understood by CAC members. So we're definitely advocating for that, those recommendations and the response to the draft scoping plan from the Climate Justice Working Group to be integrated into the final plan. Next slide, please. So according to an analysis by the Climate Action Council, the public health and climate benefits of New York reaching our climate mandates outweigh the costs of reaching our climate mandates by $90 to $120 billion a year. And this figure was recently made higher because of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, which gives New Yorkers $70 billion in benefits over the next 30 years. And with this money on the table, we'll see health benefits earlier based on the electric vehicle adoption and electric heating in the Inflation Reduction Act from the tax credits and other incentives. Next slide, please. So here's what the draft plan needs to be doing better. Like I said before, it doesn't take into account many of the Climate Justice Working Group recommendations, and the Climate Justice Working Group hasn't even gotten a chance to weigh in on the funding mechanisms proposed and where that money goes yet. So Peter will talk more about the different subgroups that have come out of the Climate Action Council, but there's one on economy-wide strategies that deals with the actual money to fund and implement the climate plan. The draft plan throughout, we're going to get back to the presentation shortly. The draft plan throughout includes different false solutions, what New York Renews likes to call fall solutions, that are being promoted by industry, including hydrogen, biomethane, which is sometimes called renewable natural gas, and waste incineration, which is the burning of trash. And depending on the type of fall solution, it might be untested, it doesn't meaningfully lead to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, they can be expensive, or they have disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities. Many of these fall solutions have a combination of several of these factors. And instead of these so-called alternative fuels, we argue we should be prioritizing measures like electrification and energy efficiency from renewables that don't have these features and will use more and more renewable energy as we reach our goals. To reach our climate goals equitably, we need to ensure we prioritize electrification of major sectors of the economy. We need to ensure that there's a clear direction and benchmarks for the state agencies that have to implement this plan. The plan shouldn't all fall on one department, being the Department of Environmental Conservation, but the climate law applies to all state agencies across the board. And there are three different possible scenarios in the draft plan. We all support scenario 3, which is the accelerated transition away from combustion. And this solution emphasizes electrifying everything possible and also relies on fewer fall solutions, like we mentioned earlier. We're witnessing that the polluters are really invested. They know that they have a lot to lose, and they've been continuing to email Climate Action Council members and ask for Climate Action Council members' time and even present post-comment period. So that means we need to ramp up our advocacy as well, and that's exactly what we plan to do. Next slide, please. So some other issues with the draft plan that we need to address before the final plan is issued. Building out a fossil fuel infrastructure, for example, continuing to build pipelines for alternative fuels like biomethane, is inconsistent with addressing the climate crisis, and it's contrary to what we need as New Yorkers, our public health, especially since this is a climate justice law. We can't have building out a fossil fuel infrastructure at this point if we want to reach our goals. The final plan also needs greater emphasis on waste reduction at the source and a benchmark plan to phase out the burning of trash as a waste management practice. That's not something included in the draft plan. The final plan needs a revamped transportation section that focuses on expanding the electrification of public transit and reduces the vehicle miles traveled. We want fewer cars on the road, not more. And these are just some of the non-negotiables that we have around the final scoping plan. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Peter Awanowitz, who is actually on the council, and he's a fierce and vocal ally that gives us a lot of support as advocates. And he's going to give us some good news on the impact that New York Renews' advocacy has had so far. So thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Amanda. Really a pleasure to be here with you all. I appreciate that amazing walkthrough that Amanda just put us through, and at the top, Celeste, your kind of grounding in where we are and where we need to go. Both of them were just wonderful. By further introduction, for those that don't know me, Peter Iwanowitz. I have the pleasure of being Executive Director of Environmental Advocates NY. I'm a longtime steering committee member of New York Renews, helped bring it together 7 years ago when New York Renews was founded. I've been a steering committee member ever since. And as Amanda said, I'm a member of the Climate Action Council. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am white. I have brown hair that's thinning rapidly on top as I age exponentially with the climate work. And on Zoom, I just look like a person on the screen. And in real world life, if you see me, I'm about 6'4" in height, which always catches a lot of people off guard for the first time they meet me in person. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. As I said, if you look at the chat early on, being at the People's CAC really grounds me, but it also helps steel my resolve to become, as Amanda described me, a fierce advocate and friend. So this is where I get that boost of B12 advocacy to go into the Climate Action Council, and there's a meeting tomorrow. So this is very timely for me to be with you all, and it's just a pleasure to be here. If I could have the next slide, I'd appreciate it. I think the really important thing that I wanted to sort of convey to you all as a frequent visitor to the People's CAC is that from January to July of this year, the public had a chance to weigh in on the draft scoping plan. And let me just tell you, one, I attended all the hearings, only had to do one virtually, but I was in person at all the hearings. Two, I'm going to relay to you just sort of the breadth of impact that NY Renews and the People's CAC had in the process. But as this slide indicates, 10,000 comments came in directly attributed to the work of the People's CAC and all the groups working through NY Renews. That is, it's a third of all the total comments that came in. And if you just revel and think about that and just pause and applaud yourselves, applaud your friends and your colleagues that sort of worked on this. This is a tremendous sort of showing of the strength and power of the people coming into a process that has been almost virtually held in the online sort of forum. There haven't been very many public meetings of the People's CAC, the Climate Action Council. We're getting back into that space. But just to invest the time and energy to reach out to people, to get them to comment on this is just tremendous amount of work. And to see 10,000 comments coming in, it's just really, really gratifying. And I know that some people who weren't able to join us for the People's CAC tonight already looked at the email. And I got to tell you, I look at my phone all day today, and my personal email inbox is a mess. And it's a beautiful mess, because people are taking the time out today to send comments into the CAC to tell them what the final plan has to look like. So it's all very, very gratifying. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to read this word. No, I'm not. These words should look very familiar to you, because these words on this slide are a recitation of the comments that have come in from NY Renews. This slide and several others that were presented to the Climate Council, and this is text taken right out of that presentation this summer, walk the council member through the breadth of the comments that came in. And there were, again, several other slides that really demonstrated for the council the volume of comments that came in on these issues. So it was about full speed ahead with electrification. Don't get distracted by things like hydrogen, renewable natural gas, or CCS. Really strong provisions for indigenous sovereignty, decarbonization of the transportation sector, and don't get into sort of any gaming with offsets and using biofuels there. I mean, just these words are your words, and they were presented as you see them here on the screen to the council, of comments that had come in that had made a substantial impact. And these comments and the other ones that were made are helping to sort of shape the final plan so that it is better than the draft that was released in January. So if you have taken the time to comment, thank you. If you are still thinking about getting engaged in the comment process and to urge the CAC to do the right thing, take action tonight, a little bit later in the meeting. Make sure that the next 10 weeks really count. We need to make sure that this final plan that comes out at the end of December is worthy of the bold appellation that people have given it to it as the world's most ambitious. We need to hold the polluters at bay. I'll tell you in a minute what they're up to. And we need to hold government officials, most notably Governor Hochul, completely accountable to put the interests of New Yorkers, the people before the profit of the industry. So I'd love to have the next slide, please. So as Amanda had alluded to, the Climate Action Council looked at a couple of key issues coming out of the comment period and looked at three main issues that we needed to develop subgroups on. I had fought and lost the fight to have these subgroups meeting in the public. My fellow council members are a little bit shy about just debating these things in public. I'm always up for a public fight and a public discussion. Anyways, the council created three subgroups. One to look at alternative fuels, primarily hydrogen, and also, as Amanda called it earlier, renewable natural gas. And when you think about renewable natural gas, it's the waste gas that comes from three main sources. It comes from landfills, it comes from agricultural waste, and it comes from human waste at wastewater treatment plants. That's the main sources of biomethane that needs to be captured because it's a pollutant, but it's a waste gas. And green hydrogen, I think a lot of people know about that. There's this sort of cottage industry that's sort of created as our pathway out of climate change is to continue combusting things, but instead of gas, we'll be combusting hydrogen in its place. And you can imagine what could go wrong there. So alternative fuel subgroup is looking at those things. There's also a group that's looking at gas system transition. And really the debate there is how fast we electrify. I mean, we all know what we have to do. We cannot meet the interim goals of 2030 if we're still building new buildings that are hooked up to fossil fuels. They need to be all electric as fast as possible. And we need to have that happen soon. And then we have to transition the existing building that we have off of fossil fuels no later than 2050. There's just no shot in the world of hitting our goals unless we electrify. But there's a huge debate. Do we allow for some fuels to play a role in the short, long, or the short, medium, or long term? So the council's been wrestling with that issue. And then the third subgroup was to looking at economy-wide strategies. This is basically shorthand of how the heck are we going to pay for all this and do it in a way that also achieves the emission reduction goals. So things like cap and invest strategies, where you cap pollutants and then you make polluters pay a fee for the emissions they belch out. And then you use those fees and invest them in clean energy technologies. 40% of the investment should be in disadvantaged communities. So we're looking at things like cap and invest strategies, and we're looking at things like an across-the-board polluter penalty or a carbon tax. People who have been close attention to the economy-wide strategies and read that chapter will note one thing. In the green box at the bottom of this slide, it says cap and invest or carbon tax. There was one other economy-wide strategy that fell off the table. And the reason why it fell off the table is because a huge volume of commenters said, we would not want the climate plan to have something called a low carbon fuel standard in it. The draft plan rightly calls these clean fuel standards as something that would be regressive, leading to pollution hotspots, which led me as a member of that work group to argue vociferously, this is where people are. And by the way, these strategies, they don't fit within the law. They're illegal. So we can't move in that direction. They may try to bring it back in a very limited way to deal with transportation sector, but there are going to be so many constraints on the ability to do that because clean fuel standards are regressive and they lead to pollution hotspots that it's not likely to do it. So there are huge fights happening behind closed doors as industry lobbyists are pushing the agencies and pushing the governor to weaken the draft plan to allow for the status quo to continue and allow for us to burning fossil fuels in buildings and vehicles. And there are going to be more fights at the public meetings of the Climate Action Council, probably starting tomorrow and going into the rest of October and November and December. And these are some of the big issues that are on the table right now. And I'll take the last slide just to kind of wrap up here. The main point I think I want you to take away from my talk is engagement and involvement of people is making a difference. Often it probably doesn't seem like it. The Climate Action Council meetings themselves that are now just getting back into open forums really might not seem like the venue where people are making a difference. But if the polluters have their way, and continue to lobby behind closed doors and spend millions in public relations campaigns, the AstroTurf campaigns and otherwise. And if the members of the council, the agency reps, and indeed Governor Hochul himself doesn't feel like the public is heavily invested in watching and will hold our leaders accountable, then the polluters will win. And the essential thing that we're fighting back against is that first bullet on this slide, is that the fossil fuel companies think that the winning message with the broader public and with agency people is, let's keep all options on the table. We will fail the climate law if we keep options on the table. People will continue to get sick. Some will die prematurely. Our communities are going to continue to get devastated by the climate crisis. And we will all lose out on the economic benefits of our climate law if we keep all options on the table. We can't afford to keep all options on the table. We need to rapidly decarbonize and move away from combustion of not fossil fuels, but all fuels as fast as possible. The time for keeping options on the table is well past. We need to have things fall off the table and move rapidly towards electrification of our buildings and our transportation sector. And we need to do it with an entirely laser-like focus on ensuring equity and justice to deal with the legacy of environmental racism, to ensure that we have a just transition for workers and communities. And that's what the fight is really about. Do we sort of stay wedded to the dirty ways of the past, or move New York State forward to address climate change and other pollutants, as well as creating equity for those who have been bearing the brunt of the disproportionate impacts of climate change? So thank you very, very much for giving me some time to walk you through what's going on and where we think things are heading with the Climate Council.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you so much, Amanda. My name is Aurora Crooks. I am with NY Renews. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a 5'7" Black female with curly black hair. And so with that said, next slide, please. So disinformation is becoming a really, really big issue as we work really, really hard to pass the provisions of the CLCPA as outlined in the draft scoping plan. And so as the CAC moves closer and closer to finalizing that scoping plan, the use of misinformation and disinformation are tools that the fossil fuel industry uses to create disinterest in climate action or sway New Yorkers away from climate action. And so I'm going to walk you guys through the differences. So it's like, what are the differences between misinformation and disinformation? And I'm going to walk you through those a little bit. There is a difference, and they're used interchangeably, but there is a difference between misinformation and disinformation. So what I'm going to start with is actually misinformation. And so misinformation is the sharing of information that is false or incorrect. That can be intentional or it can be completely unintentional. What disinformation is like the intentional spread of misinformation. And so when someone's spreading disinformation, it's a very, very decisive and often very, very destructive tool to use to spread confusion, essentially. And so, and also a distrust of science and news and research. So people who want to spread disinformation are usually very, very consistent about putting out a specific narrative that causes people to believe a thing that isn't true, which would be misinformation. And so most misinformation and disinformation content about the climate crisis and renewable energy is funded by a handful of industries that, stand to gain a lot from spreading disinformation, right? Mostly fossil fuel groups, and they often are funded in addition by like several conservative think tanks and some front groups that tend to fund those. Next slide, please. And so why does this matter? Why does climate misinformation and disinformation matter if we know what the truth is, right? And why that's important is every myth, every lie, every conspiracy, everything that's put out there that goes against what we know, what the science is, and what our lived experiences are in these EJ communities only turns another obstacle. And while we really race to fight for climate action, climate equity, and policies that are going to allow these communities to thrive. And so confusion and polarization and mistrust are like the exact it's what they want. This is what the fossil fuel companies want, and they're using this to push an agenda about oil and gas that's needed. They're pushing an agenda about oil and gas being an absolute necessity to thrive when that is absolutely 100% not the case in the slightest. And so in addition to using all of those things, they use bullying, they use dismissiveness, they use racism, they use misogyny, and all of those are like integral to creating disinformation and making sure that people are polarized so that they can get their mission accomplished. And yeah. So, you know, in the bottom photo, you might know Raya Salter, who was also on the CAC alongside Peter, and she was called a boo and, you know, spoken to in a very misogynistic fashion by the Congressman of Louisiana. And these are unfortunately not uncommon. And notably, climate advocates are often shouted down during Climate Action Council hearings. And it works to kind of sow a sense of fear and uneasiness and uncertainty that only further weakens our like fight and like, you know. Next slide, please. And so research has shown that like spreading disinformation works. Why do they do what they do? They do it because it works. And it contributes to everything from like political inaction to not caring to rejection, outright rejection of these policies. And so, you know, using intimidation tactics like yelling and sowing doubt, they're going to continue to kind of use those kind of tools to make sure that we don't get what they want and that they keep their money in their profit while we continue to suffer in our communities. And so the polluters here are mobilizing, right? So they don't go out and say, we are the fossil fuel companies and we want to maintain our profits and while the planet cooks. They're not going to do that. They're going to create front groups. They're going to create tons and tons of different little things to make sure that they're getting their message across without seeming so direct about it. And so, you know, there's a bunch of different groups that, you know, deliberately spread disinformation and are funded by a variety of different sources. One of the notable ones is called New Yorkers for Affordable Energy. And New Yorkers for Affordable Energy is an opposition group that includes National Fuel Gas. They're also a member of which member CAC Donna DeCarlis is a financial backer of, and Gavin Donahue was on their steering committee. So they're a fossil fuel front group and they mobilize fear and they use fear tactics to make sure that people feel like their utilities are not going to be protected or that jobs will be lost. They use any kind of fear of people's livelihoods to maintain their own profits, which is fundamentally unethical in addition to being, you know, everything else that it happens. And so don't be like, I'm speaking to you guys, but just don't be fooled by these names. Don't be fooled by these folksy sounding, you know, seemingly sincere sounding group names. They're very slick. They know what they're doing. They have huge billions of dollars to throw around with every campaign. And they have a vested interest in keeping New Yorkers in the dark about the benefits of transitioning towards renewable energy. They have a stake in that. And so those groups also tap into their customer bases, especially gas utilities, again, to spread out disinformation. And yeah, and so, you know, that's kind of the bad news, but there's always good news. And the good news is that the Hochul administration appears to be feeling some pressure about the CAC and the working groups. And, you know, it seems to be that the pressure is working in our favor. And so, yeah, this is kind of some of the stuff. And so next slide, please. And so the fossil fuel industry's kind of current plan or their current strategy is just to encourage disagreement, encourage fear, and kind of muddle the facts of the scoping plan as a way of fostering division. And so some of the examples of disinformation that we've heard so far is, you know, some of the lies that we've maybe kind of heard are, you know, the state and local tax revenue is going to drop. People will flee New York, they'll run away. And that's not true. The truth is, as New York goes green, it'll become a magnet for many businesses that are investing in green economy as it becomes a bigger and bigger industry. And then another lie that they love to use is that taking away natural gas will leave us cold and in the dark. That's not true either. We have a planning process of getting rid of gas. And we will ensure that New Yorkers' energy needs will continue to be met. Nobody's going to just suddenly be cold or in the dark. It's not going to happen. We're transitioning off and people will still be warm and safe in the process. And the last one that they really, really love to use is that the climate plan is going to raise everyone's utility bills. This is not true. Renewable energy is getting cheaper every single day, and it is less volatile. Therefore, it's not only resilient and reliant, but it also keeps us safer and saves lives in that way. And so, next slide, please. So how does it spread and how can you spot it? And so ask yourself, if you read something and you're just like, I'm not sure about that, I think one of the things you can do is, first of all, read the source. Do you recognize the source? And does it reference one that you can easily find? And does it make the information in the post seem believable? And is it written in a style that you'd expect from a professional news organization? So just certain things to kind of look out for as you kind of see, and you will see more of it as we go forward with the next legislative session and over the next year. You will see more and more frontline groups, more and more random groups appearing out of nowhere, seemingly saying these things. And, you know, always check the source and look at them very, very closely, because only more of them are going to appear because they want to spread as much disinformation as possible to get their goals accomplished. And so, yeah, next slide. And so with that said, I am going to, I guess, say that what can be done about it is kind of saying things like, you can support NY Renews in our actions. You can verify articles. Be sure to verify articles and social media posts by using websites like Climate Feedback or like Fact Checker to verify climate news and articles. Ignore conspiracy theories. It can be hard to do, but it is doable. Like, ignore conspiracy theories on the internet and definitely don't repeat them to people, because people can end up believing them and sharing them. And don't use unknown sources or statements without support that are not like well reasoned through, as people can tune out and ignore like actual credible climate news. And so with that said, I hope you guys found this information insightful, and I will pass the baton over to Celeste, who will walk you through actions and ways you can help.
Thanks, Aurora. Next slide, please. So the best defense is good offense, right? So we know we need to fund this law, and we need to continue to be proactive and take legislative interventions to make sure that it's properly implemented. So we have a few opportunities for action here. So firstly, we have an updated Climate Action Council toolkit, which will be dropped into the chat, as well as some top line one-click tools that once you click them, it will send an email to the Climate Action Council members, individual email addresses, and those messages will contain our top line arguments, and you can edit the tools as you wish. So you don't have to directly use the same language if you don't wish to say what's in the one-click tool, you can edit them. But we've put that in the chat, our one-stop shop toolkit. So please keep the toolkit at your side. Feel free to share it over the next few months as we continually update it. So that way you have our latest one-click tools, talking points, and the instructions around this process. So New York Renews is also going to be having a campaign launch on November 16th. Sorry, I think somebody might not be muted. So yes, so New York Renews is having a campaign launch on November 16th for our legislative platform that we've been working on for months. And it is called the Climate Jobs and Justice Package. So the result is a package that, if it's passed, would fully fund the state's promise of climate justice. So to kickstart our campaign, we'll be holding at least 8 events and press conferences statewide. So you can find an event near you and mark your calendar today. So you can register at the link that is in the chat. And of course, we'll be following up with you all that are here on next steps as well. There will also be a call on the Climate Jobs and Justice Package and an info session as well, which is October 24th. So we will also be sending that out also. So feel free to join. Next slide, please. So New York Renews is starting to show up and deciding to be more creative in the Climate Action Council spaces. They are subject to public meeting law, so anyone is able to attend them. Well, we can put you on notice if you guys would like to join any of these meetings, and you would like people to join. So this is especially important during the December 5th, December 19th vote on the final scoping plan, which is going to be a focal point for direct accountability. So what you see here on the slides are the dates of the Climate Action Council meetings that will be happening towards the end of the year. We're concluding 2020. Next slide, please. So the Climate Action Council is actually meeting tomorrow. The event will be in person as well as being streamed online. So you can register to attend the event. We are putting it also in the chat. And you could pre-register for those if you are able to attend that. Next slide, please. So we just really want to thank you guys for being here with us tonight, showing up, continuing to take action, and for committing to our ongoing work. We know that many of you on this call have been tirelessly working within your communities and your organizations. And we hope that this information and tools provided tonight will be of service to you. Next slide, or is this it? So yeah, if you guys have any last questions that you would like to drop in the chat, please feel free to do so now. We will also be sharing some of these resources via email as well, if anybody wasn't able to grab them in the chat. But yeah, stay tuned for some more ongoing work, ongoing resources. Thank you again for joining us. And if none of your questions if weren't answered directly, feel free to email us, reach out to us. And yeah, thank you guys for being here.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was great to have you here, and we will be in touch with resources. We're doing this on an ongoing basis. Thank you. Thank you for caring and taking part.
Thank you guys.
I'm going to end the meeting for all. If you have any additional questions, you can reach out to me at asachs, SACHS, @eany.org, and we will be following up. So stay in touch. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.